I'll show you the slides.
So do you remember the handout I gave you? So I gave you a handout for all the different procedures. There.
Oh, and
I gave it to you like 4 weeks ago.
See, with this one, I got it wrong.
Which one?
For the gram stain, I got it wrong, but it says ethanol, and that's what I put.
So last time we had finished talking about some of the protozoans, but we did not cover the dinoflagellates, right? We didn't cover the oh, you weren't here. Let me pull that one up. Give me just a second.
Oh yeah, I can upload it.
No, because when I get a call, it just skips it to the next. I always have recorded once.
Good night, Miss Sarah.
Oh,
I'm gonna pause it and do that.
yeah, it was just very
Damn right.
You always use it.
I think the email is better. Yeah.
Okay. Last time we had finished talking about the AP complexa, and so I told you all that I wanted to put the dinoflagellates here because they're not really parasites, but I don't have any other place to talk about them. So these are algae that do have a lot of clinical relevance. And so this is the way they look. So you guys, they're quite beautiful, right? So you can see the intricate design with electron micrograph. This particular image is on the Caribbean Ocean. And so this person is just kind of pushing his hand in the water, and you can see the dinoflagellates are lighting up the water. Right? They're quite beautiful. They phosphoresce. So they're quite beautiful, except that they produce toxins. You can see that they are related to a lot of the other protozoans, because here you can see are the here are the dinoflagellates right here, right? And you can see how they're related to the ecomyclexins that we just talked about and the ciliates. Okay? So they are phytoplankton. They produce toxins. They cause red tides and brown tides, and they bioluminesce. Okay? This is why they're important to us. Here you can see is the Louisiana coast, right? Right by the mouth of the Mississippi. And this whole area right off of the Louisiana coast is hypoxic. What does that mean? It's hypoxic. There's no oxygen. So this is a dead zone. So there is no life in this area, and it's getting worse because of the amount of nutrients that are coming down the Mississippi River. You have a lot of nutrients coming out for people who are farming and all kinds of different things, ranching. And so you have a lot of those nutrients coming down, and they're causing this algal bloom,
Okay,
which
that's the only
causes
one I was
this
able to
toxin.
print, because the girl didn't run in.
So here you can see,
Are the ones that are causing?
no, the
Did
nutrients
we print the wrong one?
are the food, they're the nutrients so that
Oh,
they.
that they're eating off.
Yeah, so listen, guys, so there are there's a lot of reasons why these red tides and brown tides happen. But it all centers around the amount of nutrients, right? So nutrients coming in because of fertilization, there could be floods, there could be hurricanes that are putting a lot of nutrients into the water basin. All these things lead to these algal blooms.
They're growing off of that.
They're growing off of that. So here you can see is the kind of the bay side, and this is the ocean side, and you can see that the bay side is being protected, but the ocean side is having an algal bloom. Okay? Here's this hypoxic.
HYPO. No
Okay? So here you can see the algal bloom. It gets much worse.
Is that green?
Yeah, but here is Carenia. Carenia is one of the, there's a few of them that can cause a red tide. And this is what a red tide looks like. So since I've been alive, there've been 2 red tides in Corpus. And they killed a lot of the fish and a lot of
I
the,
think it's South Florida when
It's like the last paper.
it was bad.
Yes.
So they produce toxins. The toxin they produce is called zaxitoxin. Zaxitoxin is a neurotoxin. So it paralyzes all of the wildlife and they die. And so they wash up on the shore like this, and there are people picking them up and gonna take them home, and the game wardens were saying, no, you can't do that, because the toxins biomagnify, they get larger in these animals. The one that I worry most about are the oysters, because almost nobody's gonna pick up fish that are dead, right? But people love raw oysters, including me, but I will not eat raw oysters anymore, because I like to mitigate risk. And the toxins that are produced by these organisms biomagnify in the oysters. So if you eat the oysters raw, you can get paralytic shellfish poisoning, and you can be seriously hurt or affected or die. Okay? Now, I still eat oysters, but I eat them fried, I eat them sauteed, or I eat them in roux. But I'm not.
Eating them up takes away these toxins.
It degrades the toxin. The toxin's a protein.
Okay.
So, okay? So here you can see is the name of the toxin, zaxitoxin. It's a neurotoxin. So if you, since I love Halloween so much, you might know that zombies are a big part of Halloween. They're also a big part of like The Walking Dead and World War Z and all kinds of things like that. But the zombie lore started a long time ago, and the only people who could make zombies were voodoo practitioners, right? Because they would use toxins, tetrodotoxin from the fugu fish or zaxitoxin from these algae. They would put the people in a state of animation or in unanimation, so they would be static, but they would still be alive, right? They couldn't move.
I think
So
that
this
was
is where
one.
zombies are.
This is where zombies first started. Right nowadays, zombies, I mean, if you remember in the 1970s, zombies would walk around, but all you had to do was be able to run a little faster and they'll never catch you.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the zombies run and they communicate with each other. So nowadays, the lore is that viruses cause zombies, right? And so you can see how this is manifested over a long period of time. Okay? So this is why I wanted to talk about the dinoflagellates, because they're really important because they produce toxins and they can cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. Okay? So I told you at the end that we would talk about the life cycle of malaria.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're gonna do. So if we look at malaria, right, it all starts with a mosquito like this. Now this is Aedes. This is one of the most aggressive mosquitoes there is, and you can tell because it's got these bands on its legs, right? So this is Aedes. It is not the mosquito that transmits malaria, but this one is the big culprit of all kinds of problems in Texas. West Nile, chikungunya, there's a whole bunch of different infectious diseases that can transmit. If we look at malaria itself, right, this is a normal red blood cell, and this is one that's infected by Plasmodium, by the organism that causes malaria. Eventually what will happen is it'll produce a whole bunch of trophozoites, merozoites. They'll come out, and each of these then can infect other red blood cells. It's tragic. We lose about 1 million people on an annual basis to malaria. And we have about 3.5 million infections in the world to malaria on an annual basis. We lose a third of those, right? So about 100,000. Last year, because of the pandemic, it was only 850,000, right? But still, that's a lot of people. Yeah. So if we think about this, malaria has a very complicated life cycle. I have created a life cycle for you that's real easy to understand. So you will be responsible for this life cycle. It's the only life cycle you're responsible for the exam. Okay?
Wait, it's the only life cycle?
That you are responsible for our exam 3.
Okay, we're
Okay? So, yep,
There was no slide for that.
it is there.
It's there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I'll look again, but if it's not, I
It's
will
here.
put it for you.
We're looking at it.
It's here. It's here.
This is on okay.
We got you, Keon.
So there are two stages of the life cycle. There is the sexual state that happens in the mosquito and the asexual state that happens in the human, okay? So the asexual state is what causes all the really, really serious symptoms. High fever, bed shaking chills, blood bursting, it's all kinds of craziness, right? And it's a cycle, so it starts somewhere. So we're just gonna start it here, right? So a zygote gets produced, and produces sporozoites. The sporozoites then migrate to the salivary glands, right? So once it gets to the salivary glands, then a mosquito takes a blood meal, and when it takes a blood meal, it injects it into humans. We are the definitive host for malaria. And now there are other species of malaria that will infect other organisms, but we're the definitive host for 6 different species of malaria. The one that is most damaging is Plasmodium falciparum, and it has about an 80% mortality rate. It's pretty high. Okay? So, once the mosquito takes a blood meal, the sporozoites are injected into our bloodstream and they migrate to the liver. In the liver, they become mature and they become merozoites. The same thing as a trophozoite, okay? Those merozoites will infect other red blood cells and produce more merozoites, and that cycle continues. This is the cycle that causes all of the symptomology of malaria. So if you want to see a really good movie about the symptomology of malaria, Mary and Martha is a really good movie about malaria. It's very sad. Okay? Some of these merozoites will eventually differentiate into male and female gametocytes, right? Sex cells, if you will. And another mosquito has to inject both the male and the female gametocytes. When they do that, it's on blackboard. When they do that, they migrate to the lumen, that's the intestinal tract of the mosquito. They fuse and form a zygote, and the zygote produces sporozoites. And the cycle continues on and on and on.
So a zygote is a fusion of the male and the female?
Mhm.
Okay.
In early stages of pregnancy, the zygote is the union of the ova and the sperm. And eventually it becomes a developing fetus, and then eventually it becomes a baby when it gets born. Okay? So it's very complicated, right? So in order, we have the technology to defeat malaria, but the problem is where it is in the world doesn't have the infrastructure or the money to fight it. Where it's not in the world, here in the States and in Canada and lots of parts of Europe, where they have the technology, they don't really need it because they don't have malaria. We had malaria before. We've had malaria here in the States, in Everglades, in Louisiana, and in Houston. But we did such a really good job of education back then in the 50s and eradication of the mosquito
Even recently.
that we just don't have malaria. We are primed for it though. We have the perfect conditions in Texas for malaria. And we have Anopheles here. Right? The mosquito, Anopheles. Okay? Any questions? So in order to combat this, you would have to fight malaria on lots of different fronts. You would have to attack the mosquito, and then you'd have to attack the infection in the person. We typically do one or the other. Are you with me? So we attack the mosquito, but then, well, so-and-so's got malaria, oh well, they just have to take care of it themselves, right? Instead of having a group effort of saying, we gotta get rid of this, because it's killing lots of people. We don't do that, okay? Unfortunately. Any questions?
So what's the infrastructure that protects us?
Mosquito nets, there's a bunch of things.
Oh.
I mean, there's a bunch of things you can do for it, right? Taking prophylaxis, right? And so there's a bunch of things we could do, but where the malaria parasite really is in the world, South America, Asia, and African continent, they don't really have the infrastructure or the amount of money it would take to fight. So, you know, getting back to evolutionary fitness, right? So what does that mean when you say evolutionary fitness? What does that mean? It means that, huh?
Like teens, you know.
No, that's adaptation. But evolutionary fitness is that, is simply an overproduction of offspring. And that's how we get around malaria. We have a lot of people in the world. Are you with
So
me?
there's more of us than of the
Yeah.
mosquitoes. It does not seem like that.
So one of the things that has adapted, since you brought it up, is sickle cell disease. So you guys may have heard of that. And so what happens, these are normal red blood cells, but sickle cell red blood cells look like this. And these particular sickle-shaped red blood cells are a recessive trait that some people have. And when they have it, or they carry the trait, they are resistant to developing malaria. The malaria parasite doesn't recognize them as being infectable. So they don't get it. The problem is, sickle cell is much worse than malaria, right? So evolution sometimes gets it, right? But what we know is that even if you carry the trait, you're protected from malaria. And we used to think that there was a lot more people who were carrying the malaria trait than were actually showing the trait. But recent papers have said, no, that's not true. It looks like there's more people with sickle cell disease. Right, so
In those areas or like just?
and those, now we have sickle cell individuals in the States, but that's because.
Is it hereditary?
Yeah, well, it's genetic, right? But that's because we have people from Africa who've come here. Every single one of us are derived from people from Africa. Okay? And so we have this out there, but it's much worse, right? And so the thing about sickle cell disease is not only is a malformation of the red blood cells not allowing the red blood cells that are sickle shaped to carry nutrients properly, but they also cause blood clots, and they can be seriously painful and can lead to infarcts and all kinds of other things, right? So I don't know.
Infarct, heart attack?
So I don't know if I told you this, but when I was growing up, I had a friend who had sickle cell disease. And when he got, did I tell you this? If I told you this, tell me, I won't tell the story again, because it's kind of sad. But at 10th grade, he called us over, his closest friends, his besties, called them over, besties. Called us over to his house, had a party. It was his birthday, but he announced that he was no longer going to take treatment for malaria, or sickle cell, sorry, for sickle cell. And he died 6 months later. But he was just tired. And it was going to be for the rest of his life. Nowadays, we've got other treatments.
I was gonna say, how do we combat it now?
Well, so we have medications they can take to help, but also, there's been 3 trials that have used CRISPR technology. Does everybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So CRISPR technology is a gene editing tool. What they're doing is they're going in with the normal gene of the red blood cells and they're putting it into the sickle cell red blood cells. And they're hoping that at some point those enough of those cells will take over and there won't be any more sickle cell.
I'm
trait.
sorry, it's a touchy subject. My sister has it.
I'm
so-
sorry.
No, it's okay, it's okay. It's 6 of us. So 5 of us have the hemoglobin C trait, but she actually has it, so.
Well, so I definitely did not mean to make you feel
No,
bad.
no, it's okay, it's okay. When
It's
I
just
talk-
science to me,
I know.
right?
So what was the
It's
treatment
something like
before?
Blood transfusions,
Oh, and that would like just make you sick or?
you know, it make you better for a little while.
You have to keep doing them in order to continue that.
So anyway, so it is a problem. Okay. Any questions? Let's talk about the metazoans. So the metazoans are gonna be all the things that people will call worms, but not all of them are worms, right? They belong to the kingdom Animalia underneath the domain Eukaryota. And so you can see the platyhelminths and the nemahelminths. So the platyhelminths are gonna be the flukes and the tapeworm, and the nemahelminths are gonna be the roundworm. those are the only true worms. So some of you might remember this as the first unit in lab, right? Usually I do this in the last unit in lab, but because we were at home for 3 weeks, I wanted to be sure that you got the best lab experience possible. So I moved some of the microscopy stuff toward the beginning so that we could look at those things and then do the manipulations, okay? They're all chemoheterotrophs, they're all multicellular, they have reduced digestive nervous systems, and they move because they have segments or grooves, okay? They're ingestive or absorptive, the way they get nutrients. They have very elaborate life cycles. That elaborate life cycle is a general theme of the parasites, right? And so that's because if they have these real elaborate life cycles, they're hard to get rid of. Okay? Cheska, will you tell me when it is 11:40? I mean, sorry, 12:40?
Yes.
12:40.
Yes.
So would malaria be considered like
It's
having an
at
elaborate life
Yep,
cycle?
but that's a protozoan. These are gonna be the larger organisms, right? And they all form embryos, right? So they're all gonna form embryos. That means that they're gonna produce ova and sperm, okay? So here are the 3 different groups. Trematodes are the flukes, that's what these things are here. The cestodas are the tapeworms, that's what this is. And then these are roundworms, these are the nematodes. These are the only true worms. The other 2 are flatworms. And they look squiggly and they move like worms, therefore everybody thinks they're worms, but they're not.
The trematode, that's like a liver.
A liver fluke, but also blood, there's a bunch of different ones.
Wait, you said people think that trematodes are worms, but they're not, right?
And also the fluke also. They're squiggly and they move kind of like they worms, so they all got put in the group worms, but they're not.
The only one is nematode.
The only one is
round-
nematode.
round.
So, the 2 major parts of the life cycle are the adult and the ova. And the ova are like fingerprints. If you look at the ova, you can tell what organism you're being infected by. Okay? Good? So, the metazoans are classified by the 3 S's. The 3 S's are segments, shape, and sex. And when we say sex, that doesn't mean that they have sex, they do. But that means, are there organisms that have both sex organs, or there are 2 different genders? Right? 2 different genders, male and female. So here you can see monaceous is a word that describes an organism, one organism that has both the male and the female sex organs. So here's a fluke, and so you can see here the testes, here's a seminal vesicle, there's the ovary, and this is a uterus, and you can see that it is full of fertilized ovum.
So monaceous people like both that one.
Dioecious means there's a male and a female. Okay? Good? So here you can see a fluke, and you can see all the different parts, right? So the flukes, this particular one, Cloacus sinensis, how big do you think it is? How big do you think it is?
A fluke?
A fluke. It's,
5
it's actually,
millimeters?
Bring it to
Millimeters.
it's actually about 2 to 3 millimeters. There it is.
Oh, wow.
That's what it looks
Wait,
like.
that's a fluke? A real one? I can't see that.
I wanna see.
There are some bigger ones, Fasciola hepatica. These things get so, this is a little one.
That's the liver one.
No, this is the real liver one. This one infects liver also.
Yeah.
But this one gets huge. This one gets so big it'll fit in the palm of your hand. Big. Right? So before we talk about things, is it okay if I put my collection here? Is that gonna bother you?
It's not gonna bother me.
Y'all come over here real quick.
Right?
Y'all come over here.
Oh, God.